Procedural world building is really interesting. I've spent the past few months looking into this, and I have found that you can either build a procedural generator that's incredibly easy and simple to build, or you can build something that is incredibly complex and very difficult to understand. Now, I spent the past few months building my own version of this for Altiverse, and I had a lot of very interesting little roadblocks. But I also learned a lot about procedural generation over these past couple months, and I wanted to share some of what I've learned so far. But if you enjoyed this video and want to see more just like this, be sure to like the subscribe button down below. And if you want to get a copy of the procedural generator that I'm building, I'll be sharing versions on my Patreon down below. There will be a link down there if you want to follow and get access to my own procedural generator as I'm building it. With that, let's jump right in the video. Now let's first start off on the road that actually led me into building this dungeon generator, and I think it's better that I start with the type of world that I'm trying to build. Altiverse is a VR game that I'm working on, and the idea behind Altiverse is that you play as one of 4 playable characters, and each of these characters comes from their own world within the Altiverse, a sort of Matrix type of scenario. Now, for each of these characters, they've all passed gateways that lead them not to another world, but it leads them more into an in-between sort of world. Meaning that all the things that the players are going to experience don't actually come from one world, but come from a mix of different worlds. Now, with this in mind, I wanted to make sure that players could have very unique experiences that change constantly, given that players are going to be in a constant death loop. Now, with this in mind, my immediate thought was to build a dungeon generator because this would allow for me to not only have procedural worlds, but allow for me to build worlds that were a little bit bigger than I normally would have been able to. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Now, by the end, I ended up building 5 different versions of this, and the first 3 actually weren't even fully complete because all these first 3 were trying to figure out what exactly would work and what wouldn't. Now, one of the big challenges that I faced was this is going to be a VR game, which means that I want everything to be experienced in the first person. So with this in mind, I started looking at games like Spelunky, for example, one of my personal favorite games. And Spelunky is very simple. It uses essentially a grid. You can think of it sort of like this. When the world is built, you have a single block as a starting point. Then a path is built to an endpoint at the very bottom. Now, as this path is built, it's made sure that you have a clear, followable path that will lead you to the end, and that you can't be blocked simply because you don't have enough bombs or anything like that. Although I'm sure bombs make things a lot easier. With this in mind, it then fills in all the rest of the spaces. Now, each of these blocks actually resembles you can think of them as sort of rooms. Within each of these grids is an even smaller grid that consists of things like rocks, chests, enemies, traps, and the list can go on and on and on. Now, while this works great for a game like Spelunky, this doesn't work so great for a game like Altiverse. And there's 2 reasons why. One is the context of the world. Like I said, this is meant to be a world that wasn't created by the AI running the Altiverse. This is meant to be a merge of worlds created by them, and so it's not supposed to make complete sense. There should be things that just don't, which I didn't think fit fully with the way that Spelunky did their generation. And the second thing was, I thought it was a bit too neatly structured. I don't want a perfect grid. I want for rooms to kind of be scattered about, so that way the whole world looks like it's a little bit more like a maze or a labyrinth. Now, I didn't go off on that rant for no reason. I did actually share that for a very specific reason. Despite me not wanting to use anything similar to how Spelunky does their generation, Spelunky does very clearly show how generation can be done. Now, very simply, we take a certain perspective, say in this case a top-down perspective, and then using this we build a sort of grid in order to generate the entire world. Essentially, every floor tile within this world is going to be a single block, as you can imagine it. So you can think of it like this. When a single room is built, you take a single starting point, and then from there you build out rows within a certain length to build out the entire room. Then when it's time to connect the corridors, you simply build a bunch of tiles to connect all the corridors. This makes sure everything that lines up pretty neatly and that everything is going to work at least somewhat okay. Now, the first 3 versions that I built, I actually didn't even end up fully finishing because they all ended up causing issues during the development process that kind of just led me to stop, but they were still very important for me finishing off versions 4 and 5, which were the first versions that I would consider to be usable. Now, the first 3 versions all had varying issues. For example, the first version that I created corridors that were way too long for what I wanted. So each room would actually be built in a very linear path, and all these rooms would be separated very far apart from one another. Now, if I really want to build something that was a bit more linear, a little bit more direct to an end goal, then I probably could have stuck around with this version and just simply found a way to bring all the rooms a little closer together during their generation. Essentially, all the worlds would be, if I recall, instant static meshes, and then these would build out all the different rooms, and then you would build corridors to connect all of them. Like I said, it ended up being very linear and not quite what I wanted. Not only that, but the corridors were extremely long, which there's nothing wrong with the long corridors, but I think that there's such a thing as too long in between the different rooms. Each of these rooms are where battles are supposed to actually happen between the player and whatever entities are in this level. So I wanted to make sure that there wasn't these long drawn out phases between each of the rooms. Now, to be honest, version 1, I actually mostly ended up following other tutorials in order to figure it out. And after seeing this first tutorial, I realized that this wasn't going to bring me exactly what I wanted. So I ended up deciding to go a little bit more my own route, and I developed versions 2 and 3. Now, 2 and 3 were both pretty messy. I tried to see if I could find a way to just spawn rooms outside of one another in order to make something that kind of makes sense, and then try and build the corridors in between. Now, doing this, I ran into a large number of issues. For example, when I started growing up to a certain number of rooms, the whole game would just sort of freeze, which isn't a bad thing in most scenarios. However, I want to make sure that with my game, I want there to be as seamless a transition as possible. If possible, I want to see if I can have all the levels in a single world and players just aren't able to tell. That way there's a nice and seamless transition and there's not very many loading screens, if any, between the different worlds. Now, by the end of version 3, I ended up having something pretty solid put together. In terms of the tiling, I had tiled pretty evenly spaced out. However, at this point, I still was running into the issue of spacing out the rooms. No matter what I did, it always seemed like rooms were either overlapping with one another or just were spaced out way too far, to the point where I was worried that the corridors were going to be way too long for what I wanted. Now, with this in mind, I ended up doing a little bit more research and ended up coming across this article on dungeon generation. Now, a nice thing is that this article actually showed a few images that very clearly showed how the dungeon generation process could potentially work. Now, it wasn't quite perfect for what I wanted, but it was really close to what I wanted, where I wanted all of the rooms to be pretty close to each other, but not so close where the corridors were extremely long. Now, with this in mind, I ended up doing a little bit more research into this, but the problem was, up until this point, all of my dungeon generators were single actors, meaning that I had a single actor that would spawn all of the tiles, and all of those tiles were connected to that single actor. Now, based off of what this article was saying, it was suggesting to spawn multiple rooms within a small circle. Then, after all these rooms are spawned, you simply sort of explode them out, spacing them away depending on what rooms were overlapping with which. So that way they would all line up next to or close to one another, which is pretty close to what I wanted. Now, with this in mind, I ended up going on to build version 4 because I already knew, based off of what I had seen in this article, version 3 was not going to work at all, unless I did some major modifications to how the generation process was handled. With this in mind, I went on to version 4, and this time I ended up separating out the way that the generation was done. Instead of having everything in a single actor like I had been doing up until that point, what I decided to do was I would have a single sort of manager actor that would manage all of the different rooms. Then all of the rooms would be their own individual actors. In this way, I'd be able to make sure that all the rooms were timing each other correctly, all moving on to the next states at the same time. So with this in mind, I ended up spawning all of the rooms in a pretty small location, checking to see which rooms overlapped with which, and then whenever they overlapped, I simply spaced them out one tile at a time. Now, this ended up working out really well and gave me almost perfectly what I wanted. It was only a matter of building in the corridors, which was actually really simple. All I did was for each room, they would each build out their own corridors by connecting to the different rooms. Now, in case you noticed, I did say almost worked perfectly, and I didn't say this by mistake. This did almost work perfectly. Well, all the rooms were laid out pretty nicely to what I wanted, and I was able to get the corridors to generate almost perfectly each time. There were still a handful of issues that I ran into with version 4. One of the issues was that sometimes I would have issues where rooms actually would not space out correctly. So I'd end up with specific rooms that would just kind of shift back and forth repeatedly. And so what I ended up doing to combat this was if a room shifted back and forth more than, I think it was something like 10 times, then it would actually just destroy itself. Which isn't a bad solution, but it wasn't a perfect solution because it would mean that I would miss out on that one potential room that I could have added in. Not to mention the corridor generation was not quite perfect. Remember I said that I had each room generate its own corridors? Yeah, I did, but there were two issues with this. One, I would occasionally end up with one room or even a small string of rooms that wouldn't end up getting connected to the main nodes. And this was especially problematic if the boss room was included in with that. The second issue that I ended up running into was sometimes corridors actually wouldn't complete generation. I wasn't able to really figure out why this was happening, but this was obviously a big problem because if the corridor generation never finished, the rest of the generation actually wouldn't finish either. Now, there were a number of other small issues as well that I probably could have worked around, but were still small issues that I found generally annoying. One of the issues was obviously all these rooms had to have basically the same starting point because there was no way of knowing what room would be a boss room and what room would be a starting room right off at the beginning. So what I ended up doing was having it so the starting room and the boss room would be the furthest two rooms from each other. Then all the other rooms within that would all be randomly generated as specific types of rooms, because I wanted each room to act just a little bit differently from one another. Now, while this does technically work, the problem that I had with this was this is going to make all of my blueprints incredibly messy because it would mean that every single room would need to have all of the blueprints required for every single type of room. And it wouldn't even run every single type of room's code. It would only run whatever type of room it was currently for. Now, obviously this does technically work, but it does make things pretty annoying because at the moment I want to have about 8 different types of rooms. And obviously that's going to be pretty annoying to have 8 different types of codes and trying to make them all intertwine with one another without fully messing with one another. This is just going to become way too messy way too quickly. Now, I ended up working on version 4 for quite a while, and like I said, this got really close to being perfect for what I wanted. But there was also the second issue that I was running into. The second issue was I wanted players to be able to enter into a starting area, and then if they so chose, they could immediately run towards the sort of starting portal, and then using this portal enter into the dungeon. Now, the problem is that this generation, assuming that it did finish, because remember, sometimes it wouldn't, it would take anywhere between 25 to 30 seconds to generate, which would mean that if I wanted to allow players to do this, I'd have to space them so far away that it would take them at least 30 seconds to get from wherever they spawned all the way to that starting rift. And obviously I can do this. The starting room isn't built yet, so I can technically do whatever I want with this, but that's obviously really annoying. I shouldn't be delaying players 30 seconds to get to that starting area. That just seems way too long. Now, obviously, the second solution to this is I could just wait to spawn that sort of starting rift until the dungeon was completely generated, but one, it kind of went against what I wanted for the starting area. And 2, while this does technically work, remember, sometimes this dungeon wasn't generating correctly, if it generated at all, which would mean that sometimes it might not even spawn at all and the player wouldn't even know. Now, I could probably get around this by if the dungeon didn't generate within, say, a minute, then go ahead and regenerate it from scratch. But this means that players are waiting even longer to start the game, and that just doesn't seem fair to the player, and it just seems like a huge waste of time. So I ended up building version 5, the first what I would currently call perfect version that I have built. Now keep in mind, the version 4 would generate in anywhere between 25 to 30 seconds, which, as I said, seemed a bit too long, and that's assuming that everything did in fact generate. Version 5, by comparison, by the time I was finished with it, I was able to generate in roughly 5 to 7 seconds on average. And in case you're curious, yes, I did actually time this. I was that obsessive with the timing and trying to make sure that this worked as smoothly as possible. I did, in fact, time all this, and I did spend a lot of time timing all this and trying to optimize. So with this in mind, I actually managed to get version 5 down to less than 7 seconds on average. Sometimes it would go a little bit over, to be fair, but roughly 7 seconds or below on average. Now this is significantly better, and I can space players out a little bit better like this, because they don't need to be as far away from the starting portal, and this is something that I am all right with, because chances are no matter how I build the starting area, it's probably going to take them at least 5 seconds to get to the starting teleportation anyways. So I don't mind delaying them just 2 seconds, but I'll probably see if I can't do a little bit more optimization there. Now version 5, I ended up changing quite a bit. I ended up going back to my version 3 strategy of trying to space out rooms just automatically without trying to push them out from one another, because that's what was taking the longest period of time. That, I believe on average, would take between 15 to 20 seconds of the overall generation process, which, as I said, was way too slow. Now, with the new version that I was doing, where I was having rooms be their own separate entities, this ended up working out a little bit better. So what I would end up doing was I would spawn in a single starting room. Then from this single starting room, it would then look around it to try and find another point to put the next room. It would do a quick check on an overlap and then check its bounds to see how far out it could spread out, which to be honest, I don't think is working perfectly. I'll get into that in a minute. Then once it's checked its bounds and all that, then it would go ahead and place the room there. Now, if it wasn't able to spread out enough, then it simply would just immediately destroy itself upon spawning. It wouldn't even bother trying to generate the room. Now doing this, I was able to make sure that rooms wouldn't overlap. And this ended up working out really well. And while it wasn't quite as close together as what I was getting in version 4, which, like I said, I really liked, it isn't so terribly far away that I think it's unreasonable for version 5. Now for version 5, obviously the corridor was one of the main issues that I had with version 4, and I continue to have this problem in version 5 as well, where I was having problems where corridors would start intersecting with one another, but they wouldn't start allowing each other to pass through no matter what I did. So I ended up finding a pretty good solution to this as well, and it ended up making the corridors significantly better than anything that I had in version 4. In order to solve the issue with the corridors, what I would do instead is all of these corridors would spawn from a single actor instead of each of the different rooms. This made sure that I had just one single lane of corridors throughout almost every single different room. And not only this, but this actually created some pretty interesting loops in a couple of generations that I really like. Now, I do eventually want to take this back a little bit, and I want to make it so that way the corridors will start spawning in additional loops and additional connections between rooms. But for the time being, this works really well. And like I said, while the rooms are spaced out a little bit further than version 4, and I'm not quite as fond of that, it is still pretty close, and I think it's still reasonable for what I'm trying to do. Now at the moment, version 5 I think is pretty reasonable for what I want to do. However, with that in mind, version 5, while it is pretty reasonable for what I do, the only issue that, or main concern that I have with version 5 all has to do with performance. Now, remember I said that every single room would at least attempt to generate a number of rooms around it, and then depending on how much space it would have, it would either immediately destroy itself or it would build itself out. Well, with that in mind, this does technically work, and the player's probably never going to notice this as an issue. But an issue that I have noticed with version 5 is this actually seems to generate at least 100 different rooms in a dungeon that is meant to generate anywhere between 15 to 40. Now, that's obviously a pretty big problem, because that means I'm generating probably at least 50 different rooms that aren't even going to end up being used. And this has so far created a few small issues where when I'm spawning in a specific room, it'll actually start spawning in actors that are meant to be in that room, but not despawn them when the room itself despawns. Now, I managed to work around these issues somewhat by either delaying that spawn or by simply moving that spawn to later on in the generation process, but I'm still a little concerned about performance-wise if this is going to be an issue that I'm attempting to generate 50 additional actors and then immediately despawning them. And I'm also a little curious if this might also be what's causing the rooms to space out occasionally a little bit more than I would have liked. Now, the second issue that I have, it has to do with the way that I am spawning in the tiles. Now, I decided to use an instant static mesh in order to try and spawn in these tiles. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with an instant static mesh, you basically give it a single static mesh with its material. Then, on each position where you want to spawn this mesh, you simply give that instant static mesh a new instance, and it'll spawn the mesh in that new point. And you can use this to build out a pretty nice tiling system for the grid, basically, as I like to call it. Now, with this in mind, I ended up running into a few issues with instant static meshes that had me a little bit concerned about performance. Now, the first issue is I wasn't able to simply hide or distance call specific rooms or tiles or anything like that. And this is obviously a very big concern that I had going into this. At the moment, on my last test in version 4, once the dungeon was finished generating, my Quest 2 was actually getting roughly 20 to 30 FPS whenever I was actually in the dungeon. Now, obviously this is less than ideal, and this was part of the reason that I had this concern with instant static meshes. I did a little bit more research into this and found that instant static meshes don't seem to do distance culling whatsoever, which means I can't really not render any specific room that I don't want. Now, the second issue that I ended up running into this was I tried setting up LODs, and I did actually end up testing this in Editor, and the problem with LODs is when you're using an LOD on an instant static meshes, typically it uses the screen space in order to determine when a specific LOD should happen. Now, with this in mind, the entire instant static mesh becomes the LOD, which means that for larger rooms, you have to go even further to trigger a specific LOD than if you were looking at a smaller room, for example. Now, the solution that I've come up with this, and I still have to test, so I don't actually know if this works yet, is I ended up deciding to use static mesh components instead. And using these static mesh components, I'm going to distance cull each of the floors, walls, and ceiling only for rooms. And this is also why it was good that I actually ended up separating out the corridor into a separate actor. I still want all the corridor to show up, and so the corridor is still going to remain an instant static mesh like I would like for it to. I'm less concerned about the corridor and more concerned about all of the different rooms in the AI that aren't really going to be necessary to render at all times while the player's in the level. Now, like I said, I haven't yet done any checks to see if this is going to lead to any performance improvements. I'll actually be uploading it to my Quest 2 later today so I can actually check and see if this will. I got my fingers crossed, but we'll see what ends up happening. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. And also leave your comments on the Dungeon Generator and Altiverse in general. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. And with that, I'll see you in the next reality.